Welcome to EPG Pathshala. I am Swati Biswas from the Department of Islamic History and Culture, University of Calcutta. Today we are going to discuss Mughal painting, the formative period and the time of Mughal Emperor Akbar. In this module, the objective is to look into how the Mughal school started as an independent school in South Asia. The role of the first two Mughal rulers, if at all, and their role during their stay at Kabul and then at Delhi towards the formation of this school. And the initial phase of the atelier of Akbar and how it developed to set an idiom which continued for the next generations to complete the genre of this school. In introducing the topic, we have to understand that Mughal miniatures have been studied and admired for a very long time. It has posed problem for scholars and admirers to grasp the aesthetic sensibility when they try to compare it with the contemporary painting style not only of the Islamic world but also of the European style that existed. Some variant of this school was noticed, but the Mughal school never aspired to become a part of that genre. From the very start, Mughal school wanted to keep the genre to itself, so the idioms were constructed from day one. The problem is, in the initial phase, is that the school is not dated. None of the work has been dated at least the time 1580s. So therefore, it brings the scholars into a problematic situation as to understand the evolution of the school. The Western or European realities which were adapted did not match the Western standard, and to a great extent became the marker of the Mughal school itself. So therefore, when there was an influx of European school into the subcontinent, the Mughal school did not take its technique but certain formats, or maybe the subjects. It was the sheer brilliance that made it stand out if compared to the contemporary Asiatic trend. As for the European trend, one has to understand it surely took help of its technique, but the sensibility was completely different. It was serving a different purpose altogether. Let's start with the initial phase, that is the time of Babur and his sons Humayun and Kamran. The Timurids were traditionally devoted to the art of books, like any other Persianate family of contemporary West Asia. The culture of book was an essential entertainment, and any cultured Persianate elite would love to keep a set of illustrated manuscripts. So the Mughal elites were no different. Babur, the founder of Mughal house, was also part of this elite. The memoir Baburnama is a fine piece of Turki prose. We have to understand that Babur came from a family which was steeped into cultural ethics. Born in 1483, recounts his life from 1494 and continued till 1530, the year he died. He has also left us a set of diwans of poems in Turki in his own annotations on it, written in Agra in 1528-29, which is now at the Rampur Raza Library, Rampur. But we have to understand that all this was never illustrated during his time. Painting of his time did not survive, but one can understand art was always appreciated in that milieu. Apart from Babur, the elite group which was always with him had this culture of book reading, or at least preserving illustrated books. So books were a part of the trade, and the artists in this milieu moved from one camp to the other in search of work. Though some of the portions of Baburnama today is missing, but definitely it can be said that it did not establish any atelier himself because Babur personally did not believe in the atelier culture. Even then, his legacy of cultural appreciation definitely was handed down to his successors who laid the foundation of Mughal painting in India. Khat-e-Babari, a special kind of calligraphy, was invented by Babur as it is mentioned in his biography Babur-Nama. Contemporary accounts confirm that immediate family of Babur practiced painting. Incidentally, this autobiographical work was later translated into Persian by his grandson Akbar and was illustrated. We have to understand that this was also a phase when calligraphy in Islamic culture was rated much higher than painting. So the calligraphers were at par with the painters or sometimes even rated more because they had the skill of calligraphing Quran. So in the Persianate culture, calligraphers and painters were the cherished possession of any political cultured group. Babur as a persona was never very enthusiastic about painting, but from his biography it is noted that he would appreciate certain painters and would critique some. So therefore, painting must have been one of the areas which was discussed very frequently in the close circle. Celebrated artists were never patronized by him surely, but he did have fine calligraphers and illuminators among his nobility. The problem lies in the mention of the term Surat Khana in his memoir. Those scholars have discussed about this Surat Khana in many a way as to what exactly was the role of Surat Khana in the political life of the Timurids or for that matter Babur. It is now believed that Surat Khana was a picture gallery where perhaps books were discussed or read out. Now, the attitude of Babur towards the importance of nature may be another reason as to why he did not appreciate painters to be promoted. Now, he was under the feeling that nature could not be depicted by the painters and it is work of the Almighty. Therefore, calligraphy is to be given more importance compared to painting. The creation of the Baburi script must have engaged him to the extent that, and moreover, his political life did not give him much space to at least think about establishing an atelier. The painting of the period would have similar to the models of Khorasan, Transoxania and Tabriz to be distinguished separately. Few works attributed to the period of Humayun can be recognized because of the characteristic headgear and other particular features. So therefore, what we see is among the princes Kamran and Humayun, the works have somehow be carried over. Babur's career also was not very congenial to the establishment of any atelier. If he had a more settled character, things could have been different, though he lacked personal inclination towards painting as discussed earlier. Moreover, distinction of paintings made at Kabul is difficult to be made even if it was done under his son Kamran. Interestingly, the libraries of the time served as the functioning scriptorium for calligraphers and painters, and perhaps Mughals' initial libraries also did the same. And it could be well possible that the painters or calligraphers, if any, were not mentioned somehow by the contemporary sources. He provided the ambience, of course, to his sons Kamran and Humayun, who had affinity towards illustrated books from the very day we know about them. Babur's contribution, therefore, to the birth of Mughal school of painting cannot be wholly denied. Now let's move to the time of Babur to Kamran. Now, Kamran, even before 1542, ordered the calligrapher Abdullah Shirazi to copy for him Jami's Yusuf-i Zulekha. Now, the colophon mentioned both the name of the copier and the patron. Barbara Smith was of opinion that the colophon must and could be false. But of course, this was also a habit that we have where later on Mughal painting, some kind of inscriptions were added later. So as such, we cannot say that this copy was ordered by Kamran, but of course that Kamran was in a habit of keeping artists in his close counter is known to everyone. The work now is in the New York Public Library, and some of the paintings, of course, were inserted later by different patrons. This was a common practice also done by the Mughals. The Mughals had this habit of inserting illustrations later when they inherited some book. Hyder Elgood, though, thought that the painting, though in the Bukharan style, was done by painters at Kabul, following traditions of Transoxania. He also mentioned about the album in the Fitzwilliam Museum, Cambridge, of a Bukharan-styled illustration from a Yusuf-i Zulekha manuscript with the colophon stating that it was written by Abdullah Shirazi for Prince Kamran. So the ambiguity remains. The illustrations mentioned above do not significantly contribute to the concept of building of early trends of Mughal painting. Nevertheless, it was important to understand the milieu in which the Mughal atelier was later developed. So therefore, we have to understand that Kamran actually paved the way for what the culture would take shape during the time of his nephew Akbar. Let's move to the time of Humayun's atelier, who is the immediate legacy that Akbar followed. Humayun, son of Babur, was the other son of Babur, was born in Kabul and led a very, very turbulent life since childhood. His father's death, he succeeded the throne in 1543. His brothers Askari and Hendel were sometimes his allies, and Kamran always posed problems for him. So there was this fratricidal strife from the very beginning. In this scenario, military campaign of Sher Shah ousted him from India, and he posed to leave for Persia and for good. First he went to Herat and then to Qazvin. Shah Tahmasp of Persia lent him support, and he moved to Tabriz and then to Kandahar in 1545. This stay in Persia strengthened his bond with Timurid culture and painting in particular. Like his Timurid counterpart, he also thought that a well-established library and a scriptorium is an essential part of any political setup. Humayun, the accomplished calligrapher himself, reconquered Kabul from Kamran in 1545. Now, let's draw about a list of artists who served Kamran and Humayun. Of course, this list again is very controversial and not always backed by true historical documents. It is very important to trace the artists and calligraphers who served the early Mughals as to understand the kind of painting done during their time. This might give an idea about the early style of influence in the Mughal atelier at all, and then one can grasp how it shifted from the set trend with influence apart from Persia and Central Asia. The Mughal atelier should remain over-indebted to the eccentric brand of drinking and painting by Shah Tahmasp in 1533, and a group of artists flocked to the Mughal camp because of this ban. It is important to trace the artists and calligraphers. The artists started shifting their base from the Safavid court and even agreed to join the Mughal rulers like Kamran and Humayun, even if their political career was not very grounded. Kabul was the center of activity of the early Mughal atelier, if it is to be called, for the 10 years ending in 1554. Bayazid Bayaz's accounts includes Muhammad and Mullah Yusuf in the list that represented the Khurasani tradition of the artists. They were very old, and by then surely Mullah Yusuf was a student of the famous artist Behzad. He is mentioned as an artist who was accomplishedly excellent work in less time. Darwish Muhammad was a Turk from Khurasan who was the other celebrated artist and a pupil of Shah Muzaffar, the famous Persian painter. Mullah Yusuf was younger and was a pupil of Behzad as mentioned earlier. Another artist who joined the camp was Dust Muhammad ye Musafir or Duste Diwana. During this time, two other painters who joined him were Maulana Abul Muhammad and the other Abul Muhammad Naqash, who was again a pupil of Behzad. Maulana Abul Muhammad was a native of Herat, so he brought certain amount of Herati school with him. The former was a teacher of Mirza Muhammad Haidar, who may have introduced the artists to Humayun. Pramod Chandra is of opinion that Maulana Abul Muhammad was perhaps the pupil of Shah Muzaffar. Now, all these artists were celebrated artists of the Safavid court who moved into the camp of Humayun, whose political career, we have to understand, was not well established, but his legacy or his closeness to painting brought these painters together into his camp. Mir Musafir was another artist who joined the Kabul scriptorium and was a Tabrizi. He was part of the team who illustrated the famous Shahnama and the Khamsa of Nizami at the court of Shah Tahmasp. In 1549, the famous two painters Mir Sayyid Ali and Abdus Samad, along with Fakhr Shahaf, the bookbinder, came over to the court of Humayun, and these two painters changed the whole history of the Mughal painting school. Now let's look into what kind of illustrations were done during the time of Humayun. We have to understand that these paintings are attached to the name of Humayun only by its nature. None of it is signed. The list mostly has paintings without the signature of the artist, and the assumption is based on the style or some element assigned to the period. Some assume illustrations of the time are the Princess of the House of Timur, the famous painting in the British Museum, which is assembled around Humayun, and it was painted definitely in Kabul in 1550. It is a kind of a belief that this was contributed by none other than Abdus Samad. Now there is the other painting which is also done by Abdus Samad, which is Akbar presenting a miniature to his father. This was perhaps done between 1550 and 1555. The court of Humayun with Humayun, Hindal and Kamran in a landscape of stones is attributed to Dost Muhammad and was done again perhaps between 50 and 55. This is a painting which talks about an incident and a picnic incident which is later on mentioned by Gulbadan Begum in her memoir. Khamsa of Nizami dated 1555 in the LD Institute today is believed to be done during the time of Humayun. It is said that some of the paintings could be attributed to Mir Musafir. Kabul scriptorium already had the milieu of larger activity. Humayun could stay in India for a year before he died, and the throne passed on to Akbar, who gave all importance to the Safavid masters who brought about a new trend. His brief stay in India before his death may not have allured large number of Indian artists to join the atelier, which is a trend soon to be followed due to many political moves taken by his efficient son Akbar, because Humayun was unable to consolidate his political position in India. So he never became very popular as a connoisseur of art, and the artist or the indigenous artist did not know about this patron much. Humayun's atelier remained much Persian therefore, with few changes which were coming in very slow pace. His group of artists were few and of a much close group. The works of Humayun's artists were full-blown Persian style, bodily transplanted to India therefore. Now let's move to the painting of the court of Akbar, who actually is recognized as a real founder of the Mughal school. He insisted to have his own atelier even at a very young age. We have to understand a small boy who came up to the throne at the age of 13 had a vision which is very different. From the very first day, he wanted to set an idiom of his painting style completely different from the Persian school, which would give him a recognition of a patron of a new genre of painting. Akbar, it is said, started learning painting from a very young age and took lessons from Abdus Samad. So a boy who could never become literate was much literate in understanding painting and its idioms. So he was quite conversant as to what was happening in the land of Persia. So he wanted to have an empire of his own and an empire with a new genre of painting. The dyslexic, illiterate ruler with a political vision tried to speak his mind through his painting illustrations. Painting for him was not only entertainment but dissemination of knowledge and information. He insisted his ministers to grow a taste for the art form, and thus a big corpus of Mughal style painting was created. The first Mughal project is very interesting. It started with a project Hamzanama, and it started in 1558, though of course the date has been fixed by the scholars after much debate from the contemporary literary sources, and it continues for long 15 years. We have to understand that these huge amount of illustrations that was done, almost 400, did not change its mood or even for its idiom. The first 4 years was under the directorship of Sir Syed Ali, and the progress of work was very slow. It then moved on to the directorship of Abdus Samad, and it was completed with the same finesse and excellence. It is said the illustrations were done in 14 volumes of 100 pages each. The illustrations were fairly large, and the calligraphy was done at the back. In between the two pages, a cloth was pasted so that the paintings became a little firm. The volumes were not bounded and were kept in boxes. Hamzanama was a unique because the idiom of the later Mughal painting was laid down in this project. So for long 15 years, the idiom was set, and in this 15 years, very few other projects were taken over. Never did the project deviate from its original skill or style. The concept of movement, which was unique to the Mughal school, was introduced here. Progression and regression was yet to be learned by the artists, and thus Persian rocks were used to divide the pages to indicate things near and far. The project remained undated, and therefore the inherent style had certain gaps or ambiguities for the posterity. Now, what were the projects done post Hamzanama? The initial phase the studio saw when the Hamzanama project was done, two deluxe projects were taken. One is Ashika of 1568 and then the 1570 Anwari Sohaili. The scale of painting shows that Akbar was the most involved patron of the Mughal school. The range varied from astrology to astronomy, herbal books to medicine, cosmology, treatise, theology, law. None of the subjects were left. We have to understand that Ashika was a Bukharan incomplete manuscript with 2 pages blank. So in 1568, the Mughals introduced 2 illustrations and introduced it changed the Bukharan style and changed it to a more involved movement style. Anwari Sohaili was the first deluxe manuscript with 27 pages of illustrations. The corpus of Nafaut al-Uns is another interesting project of this period. It's a corpus which includes Jami's biography and is a collection of potted biographies of saints and Sufis, patriarchs of Islam and Prophet. It was done in the 49th year, that is in 1603. There is this trend of completing incomplete manuscript. There are 2 very interesting manuscripts that is to be discussed. One is Tutinama, the other is Jami-ut-Tawarik. Tutinama is an indigenous Chandayana text which went into the hands of the Mughal artists, where they tried to incorporate their own style on the existing Chandayana or the Chaura Panchashika style and then add on to something new of their own. In the blank spaces, they added the Mughal illustrations. Jami-ut-Tawarik, on the other hand, was a Persian manuscript which underwent changes in the hands of the Mughal artists. So these were perhaps like scrapbooks that the artists used. But it is an interesting way of introducing one's idiom on top of the other. So these were the experiments that was always kept alive in the atelier of Akbar. Now, Ashika also was one of the incomplete Bukharan manuscript, but of course, the artist used the blank pages in 1568. A varied collection of fables was also a favorite of Akbar. He was introduced to Kalila Vodimna, which is a kind of a fable based on the Panchatantras and was very popular in Persia or the West Asia. Now, Kalila Vodimna was otherwise very violent in its mood. So somehow the young emperor did not want violence in his illustrated works initially. So what he ordered was a less of violence in these works. So he asked for a set of Anwari Sohaili and then Yari Danish was made on this basis. The first of it came out in 1570 as a first deluxe production of 27 illustrations, and then the illustration had this peculiar charcoal sketches which were never much removed, and it became a kind of a trend later. Persian and Turki literature was also illustrated in the atelier. The divans or collected works of Hafiz and Sadi, the Khamsa or the 5 romances of Amir Khusro and Nizami, and the Persian epic of Shahnama, or the Book of Kings, the poems of the Timurid vizier Alisher Nevai, who created Turki as a literary language, the romances of Delhi's most famous poet Amir Khusro Dehlavi, was also among the interests of this patron. In 1564, Akbar abolished the poll tax on Hindus, that is a jizya, and then went into the discussion of philosophy in 1577 in the Ibadat Khana at Fatehpur Sikri, resulted in massive translation of the Hindu epics and the philosophical books of different religion. The culmination was seen in the illustration of Razamnama, as the ruler preferred to call it, or what we know as Mahabharat, and then Ramayan along with the magnificent appendix to Mahabharat, the Harivams. To commemorate the first millennium of the Islamic calendar, he ordered Tariq-i-Alfi, now at the British Museum. So we understand that in the middle career, Akbar became mature enough to understand not the fact that not only his subjects were non-Muslims, and therefore there has to be an understanding of the religious basis of his subjects. So he wanted to illustrate the two epics of the Hindus, and this we know that was later copied by all his officials to understand these two epics. Along the side, he also was very conscious of his Islamic past. So, commemorating the first millennium, he ordered the illustration of Tariq-i-Alfi. He was also very proud as of belonging to the family of Timur, and thus came the illustration of Timurnama, which is kept at the Khuda Bakhsh Library, Patna now. He was also proud of his forefather Babur, and he ordered a translation of his biography, and it was done by none other than Abdul Rahim Khani Khanan in 1589 at Lahore. The chronicle of his own reign was also illustrated as Akbarnama and chronicled by Abul Fazl, probably completed in 1590, and now the presentation copy is preserved at the Chester Beatty Library in Dublin. Copies of these were also made. For example, 4 copies of Baburnama was done during his lifetime, and then again by Jahangir. The presentation of copy for Akbar is kept in the Victoria and Albert Museum in London. The Khamsa of Nizami is believed to be the most finest of the illustrated manuscripts during Akbar's period, made in the year 1595 at Agra. It boasts an elegant lacquer binding, margins illuminated in gold inks in contrasting tones with as almost infinite variety of detail, magnificent illuminated medallions and head pieces, and 44 illustrations attributed to the best of the artists at Akbar's court. 42 of these illustrations survive till date, together with the miniature depiction of the scribe Abdul Rahim, or the Kambari Kalam, a portrait of Daulat, the first of its kinds, appears in 1610, and it was incorporated at the insistence of Jahangir. But this was again another trend that we see in the Mughal painting school, where incorporations were done by later patrons. Akbar, much late in his career, showed immense interest in portrait based on European influence, which reached its zenith during the time of Jahangir and will be discussed in the later modules. His own portrait appears in a profile or a half profile, mostly in stencil. The curiosity of the artist, or rather the patron, was also found towards natural history, which again excelled during the time of Jahangir. Now let's summarize as to what we have done in this module. In this module, we have tried to look into how the Mughal school developed from the time of Akbar. But before that, what we have done is we have looked into how the mood or the culture was inculcated by the Mughals from the Persians. We have to understand the Mughals were one of the most important branch of the Persianate Timurid cultures, and therefore for them in the medieval ages that they dominated, the culture of art would be appreciated. But what we have to thank the Mughals is that they were the founders of a genre which is par excellent and can be compared to any school of the time. For further information, you can go to the text and also the website of EPG Pathshala. Thank you.